السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. In lesson 5, we'll be looking at how you get to know about the person you're considering marrying and the engagement process. So we looked at the considerations in marriage and what the purpose and intention of the believer should be when they get married. And we also looked at the criteria for choosing a spouse, right? The criteria for choosing a spouse and how you need to give primacy to religion, right? And we looked at what the meaning of deen, of religion, truly is, that it's not merely knowledge or outward religious practice, but it is deep concern for God and deep concern for good and deep concern for God's creation, but that of course must be manifest in the person's conduct and practice. And we also looked at the reality of good character, that good character is not just being nice, but that what underlies good character is that you care for people, right? So there's that close relationship between religion and character. And we looked at how it's manifest in the person being careful about fulfilling the rights of others, being careful not to harm others, being careful to always being positive and cheerful. It's that good character is manifest in being careful to recognize the good that others do and to respond to it with the good or what is better, and to be careful not to respond to others wrong with anything but the good. So we touched upon these essential considerations, and that when you're choosing someone to marry and deciding, you should not merely make a token gesture towards religiosity and character, right? But that should be the basis of your choice. That should be the basis of your choice. So we're going to look in this lesson at how you find out about the prospective spouse, reminding ourselves of what you need to find out about them, but also how you go about doing that, and some key guidance and cautions related to this process of finding out and choosing. And thirdly, the engagement. What is the reality of engagement and interaction during that period of engagement until one is married? So the first issue, finding out about the prospective spouse. The first thing to be clear about regarding that is, what do you need to know? What do you need to know? Right? You want to find out whether this person is suitable. And that suitability, above all, is the suitability of religion and character. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, if someone of religion and character who is pleasing comes to you, then marry them. Right? So what do you need to know? Right? You should be clear about that. It can help to write it down. What am I looking for in a spouse? And review what we have covered previously with respect to that. So what do you need to know? The prophetic hadiths also make clear that you don't need to know too much. You don't need to know too much, in that ultimately you can't know everything. So have a sense of clarity of what really matters to you, right? What are the considerations that Allah and His Messenger have emphasized, and then what really is meaningfully important to you. Does she really have to be at least 5'6"? Right? And we touched upon the importance of not complicating your criteria. And then when it comes to finding out, we have to remember the sunnah of taking means. That one takes means that are effective and that have within them that quality of excellence and virtue. That is the essence of the sunnah. So in light of that, how do you go about finding out? Right? Remember this distinction that we have made between the conditions, right? It's things that are conditions for you in choosing the person you will marry, and secondary considerations, right? And we know that what do you make primary? You make religion and good character primary, and that the person should be pleasing to you, right? Whether physically or as a person. And beauty is a consideration, right? The Prophet ﷺ said to look at the person, but he also reminded that beauty is not merely physical beauty. A person is beautiful in form, but they're also beautiful in character, in their conduct, beautiful in their dealings with people, beautiful in their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have to have a balanced approach to beauty. You do not deny the physical consideration of beauty, but balance that with these other aspects. Right? Balance that with the other aspects. And do not have too many considerations, right? So you have primary things that are these things have to be found. And secondary considerations. What has to be found? Deen has to be there. Right? Deen has to be there. And there's an intangible aspect of it that is the most significant, which makes the process of finding out so important. But that inward concern that is religion, right? That the person has sincere concern for God and for good and for God's creation and good character. They have signs. They have outward signs. Right? The outward is not sufficient, but the outward is indicative of the inward. Right? So distinguish between these conditions and secondary considerations. You want someone beautiful, but that's secondary, because what if physically beautiful, but what if this person has deen, has good character, you can get they seem to have a nice personality, they're a person of virtue, but he's not the most beautiful guy around, the most handsome guy around, but you find him pleasing, you could get along with him. That's why it's important to distinguish between conditions and criteria. Don't just look at a sister and say, oh, she's not dazzlingly beautiful, so I can't marry her, right? Look at the whole package, right? At the same time, you have to be aware that can you really tell whether this person is right for you, right? The ulama often use the metaphor of the watermelon, that getting married to someone is like buying a watermelon. Everything may look right on the outside, but you really don't know ultimately how the watermelon really is. And there's a part of that can you yourself really tell. And this relates to how much you can find out on your own. And the reality is that you can't really tell very much on your own. Even if you were to interact extensively with a person, you're limited in how much you can find out, because when you interact with someone, you're putting on, typically, your best face, and the other person is putting on their best face. So you're not really getting insight into those critical aspects of what a successful relationship requires, right? That how does the person act when they're provoked? Are they caring about others? Do they consider not only their own best interest but others? Are they patient? Are they forbearant? How do they deal with adversity? Do they have empathy? Do they compromise when to make things work out in a relationship, right? So you can tell a certain amount, but be aware that there are limitations, right? There are limitations in how much you yourself can find out. And then there's also the reality that when you are when you're trying to find out about someone, if you are attracted to them, right? If you are attracted to them, whether physically or at the emotional level, or you feel an inclination towards someone, that blinds you, as the Prophet ﷺ said, حُبُّكَ شَيْء يُعْمِي وَيُصِمْ, that your love for someone, for your love for something, blinds you and deafens you, right? That you may see no faults. You may see no faults. All you see is not the person themselves, but this image you had of the person. And that image can develop very quickly, right? You notice she smiled in a certain way and she took your heart, right? Same with a guy. He was, that first impression, can sometimes become fixated in one's image of another, and that's why you have to be careful of how well you'd be able to judge the person on your own, which is why it's very, very important to ask others, right? It's very important to ask others, right? So you can get a more rounded picture at various levels. One, so that your judgment isn't clouded, and secondly, you have enough to be able to make the right choice. The first consideration is, who should you ask? You should ask people who are trustworthy, right? Who are trustworthy. Secondly, these people should be people who know the person well. Who know the person well. They know them closely. And we'll be looking at the guidance of Sayyidina Umar related to that shortly, right? And it helps. Find out through the person's friends, through people who've known her for many years, who've worked with him, who maybe have had business dealings with him, who've been in the same Islamic organization or the same community group, because these people will have insights into how the person is, right? How the person really is. And what should you ask about? What should you ask about? You should ask meaningful questions, questions that indicate not just information about, okay, does she wear hijab? Does she do this? Does she do that? How much does he earn? But the meaningful questions, right? That would indicate seriousness about religion, that would indicate concern, that would indicate how they are in their character, particularly how they deal with adversity, right? How they do they get angry very fast? Are they patient? How are they in their relationships? Are they caring of other people? Do they help other people out? Are they able to get along with other people? Right? So, these are the kinds of questions you would ask, and you have to be careful here. Don't just ask anyone, right? You should ask people who have a certain degree of maturity, and that maturity may be found in people who are surprisingly young, and it may not be found in people who are old, right? But very often it is with older people that you'd find maturity, but consider who you should ask. They should be trustworthy, because you don't want people going around telling that, Sister Zubaydah is asking about Zubair, and oh my goodness, this and that, and right. So discretion is important, and it's also important that if you are going to find out, you should stress the privacy of the matter, right? And we've already talked about the process of finding a potential spouse, right? So we won't get into that, because the routes that you take, right? If you're getting your parents to help you find someone, or getting friends or couples who are married, or community leaders, right? You should stress to them the criteria that you have in mind, number one, and to stress the privacy of the matter as well, right? Because people get weirded out, frankly, right? If someone comes to you hear that Zubair is asking about your best friend in marriage, then you find out that he's asking about another friend in marriage, and then he comes asking about you, right? You'll be weirded out. So discretion is very important. And here the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ista'inu ala qada'i hawaijikum bis-sirri wal-kitman." Seek assistance in fulfilling your needs through secrecy and concealment. And secrecy here, the ulama say, is that you are discreet about things. You should have discretion, right? That you don't go around telling everyone, because it tends to be counterproductive, and this barakah is lifted from it as well. And don't ask everyone, right? Don't ask everyone. Consider carefully whom to ask, and you may ask particular questions of particular people, right? Particular questions of particular people. And with that, there's certain guidance and caution that we wanted to share, right? The first is beware of messing up in this finding out process. There's many ways you can mess up. One of them is that you can confuse infatuation with love, or you can confuse just very rather shallow attraction to actual care about the person, right? How? It's the issue of the first look. You look at someone and your heart is taken, or you interact in a limited way with someone, but that interaction is very positive. So now you have this glowing image of the person. You went to find out about Sister Zubaydah, you saw her, and the first thing you noticed was she's wearing this beautiful hijab, then she had this wonderful smile, and she was being really nice to you and courteous, and you're like, oh, and you're taken by that. And then everything seems fine. So even when she's talking about her religious practice, what she does, etc., you're not even listening, really. You're just floating, right? Because you've been looking to get married, and she seems perfect. Right? That's what comes to you. And then afterwards, you won't really ask the real questions, right? If anything, what you'll ask will just be confirming that first impression. The same thing, your Sister Zubaydah's 27. She's not quite in her late 20s or early 30s, in that danger zone that some sisters find themselves in terms of being able to get married. But she's, getting concerned. So now you find Brother Khalid, and you start talking, and he seemed very prim and proper. He lowered his, he made eye contact. He looked at you initially, but then he lowered his gaze in a seemingly modest way, and you're like, wow, mashallah, he's modest. He must be religious. And then you notice that he has a sibha in his hand, and you say, oh, mashallah, he must be so religious. But in reality, he only looked down because he's feeling shy, and he's carrying a sibha because he wanted to make a good impression, or he's carrying a sibha because he didn't want to twiddle with his fingers, and his friend gave him a sibha, prayer beads, to hold on to, right? So and little things like that, and the shirt he's wearing is so elegant, and mashallah, he seems to be, physically fit, and you're just taken by him. And then he mentions a few things in the discussion. Oh, mashallah, he seems to be so balanced and this and that. But this is not who he is. And then very often when they get to know each other further, they're just confirming those impressions, those inclinations, rather than really considering carefully what needs to be considered in order to have a successful marriage. So they're deciding on the basis of not how the person is, but images of one another. So be careful in that regard. Similarly, someone may mess up in that they ask all the wrong questions, right? You find out how much he makes, you find out this, you find out in terms of their religion, you just find out, oh, mashallah, he's very knowledgeable. He's been attending Sheikh Ibrahim's classes for the last 2 years. And mashallah, she's so Islamically active. She was involved in MSA and in this and that, and when she went to England, she actually got involved with FOSIS as well, and wow. But none of this indicates deen, truly, right? Because what you want to get at is a sense that this person has true concern, right? Outward practice may indicate it, but you want to confirm that meaning. Right? So ask the right questions, right? And consider the right things. And you can also mess up by just by tokenizing the religious considerations, right? You say, oh, mashallah, she wears hijab, so she's religious, right? Or she wears hijab and seems modest, so must have religion. Or she wears hijab, seems modest, prays 5 times a day, alhamdulillah, that's it. No, consider a little more, right? Consider a little more. And also don't just, sometimes people guys are actually looking for beauty, right? I have to marry someone who's very beautiful. And that's what you choosing on the basis of, say, no, but she has to be religious though, and that's more important. But you define religiosity in a very token kind of way, deen equals hijab, or for, in the case of a brother, deen is a beard, but not too long, and the fact that he says he prays 5 times a day, right? It needs more than that, right? You can also mess up in the negative way by losing out on good potential suitors through unnecessary exclusionary conditions. You say, she has to be, we mentioned the issue of she has to be stunningly beautiful, or he has to have a good career. Not necessarily. Maybe someone right now is just beginning to get established professionally, but they would be ideal for you in every other way, right? So, don't mess up, right, in that regards. The other way people mess up is that they approach the finding out process in a manner that ends up hurting them in their deen, right? Hurting them in their deen. And the article that we've shared with you is a good article related to that called 7 Etiquettes in Seeking a Spouse by Sister Samana Siddiqui, right? That, for example, the way you find out about the person ends up being wrong, right? That, for example, by not upholding proper Islamic conduct, right? Or by just scoping. Someone, a lot of guys are just going around on Facebook, and sisters, do likewise, honestly. How do I know? Because they tell me, right? Because they're just going around, both in their virtual life through Facebook and other social media, just scoping the territory, quote unquote, and also at conferences, right? And sometimes there's a lot of flirtation that takes place and innuendo and so on, and this is contrary to the guidelines of Islam, as Sister Samana mentions in our article, and it also goes against the Islamic quality of iffah, of dignified restraint, right? Of dignified restraint. And that iffah is very important in marriage, because you need to be able to restrain your emotional inclination from other than your spouse, than one person, right? Because fidelity is very important. But if you don't have this sense of restraint, what's going to happen, right? If you're scoping out all kinds of people and not able to limit yourself, right, and restrain yourself, really, then you're going to have the same struggle after marriage, because there's many men who are handsome, there's many men who are attractive, appealing, inspiring, and there's many women who are beautiful and who have wonderful personalities and this and that. And if you don't have that restraint, and if you can't uphold that restraint in your interaction phase, in your finding out phase, in your exploratory phase, you could be hurting your marriage very seriously, and also you could fall into the haram. A lot of people end up doing the haram, both, it resulting in zina itself, but also people, who get attracted to someone and they end up doing the haram, having haram thoughts, falling into haram action, or at the very least, they develop attachments that linger on in the future, right? So be careful. And how can you be careful? Well, there's a few things, right? If we look at the article here from Sister Samana Siddiqui, one thing is to be clear about what you're looking for in a spouse, right? And to be real about it, right? To be real about it. And that as Sister Anisa Nadir, who I spoke with once, we spoke together at an ISNA program once, mashallah. She said, if we want to have healthy Muslim families, then deen has to be first in real ways. And then a critical guidance is you have to lower your gaze, right? You have to lower your gaze, both physically and in your thinking, right? In your thinking, right? So you're considering a spouse, right? But this does not mean that you have now a free reign to look at them and to think about them in physical, in inappropriate ways, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded believers, both male and female, to lower their gaze. This is the 30th verse of Surah An-Nur, right? That tell believing men to lower their gazes and be modest. That is purer for them, for Allah is indeed aware of what they do. And in the next verse, and tell believing women to lower their gaze and to be modest and to display their adornment only, that which is apparent, and to draw their veils over their chests, right? So to uphold, there's the relationship between the physical lowering of the gaze and modesty, right? And modesty. This is modesty in looking, modesty in where you carry yourself, and it's the modesty in the way you dress, right? That you don't dress in a manner that is flirtatious, that is, would cause the other person to look at that which they shouldn't be looking at, right? And this applies to men just as it does to women, right? A lot of guys will go and they'll be there, exhibiting their body, and some of it actually now is becoming shockingly inappropriate, but also sisters need to be careful about that as well. This is true in general, but it's also true when it comes to marriage, that there's nothing wrong with dressing well and so on when you go to meet the prospective spouse, but uphold modesty, right? Both in your dress and in your conduct, in your speech, and in your thoughts, right? And it's come in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that one can and should look at the person one wants to marry, right? But this is when you are seriously considering in marriage, but one does so within the limits of modesty and with restraint, right? And the fear of Allah, Sheikh Muhammad Nur Abdullah, former president of ISNA, he notes that while there's no limit on how often one can look at the person one marries, one has to do so with taqwa, with fear of Allah, and only for the purpose of ascertaining whether the person is attractive to you, right? Whether the person is pleasing to you, not out of attraction, right? Not out of attraction, right? And you have to be careful about your thoughts. Remember that Allah knows, the tricks of the eyes and what the hearts conceal, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran. Right? Because very often people look in ways which afterwards, to be honest and frank, right, that they use, because they looked with desire, then in private they'd fulfill that desire thinking about the person in those ways, and it might be even after rejection took place, they've moved on to someone else, but those thoughts about the person, be careful what else you look at. You're only allowed to look at the face and the hands. It's sinful to look at, at the awra, right? And, the awra of a woman is much wider than the awra of a man. But be careful about these things, right? Be careful about these things. And so the lowering of the gaze is both physical and also relational, it replies to your thoughts as well. Guard your thoughts. And this is why that interaction is best, and most proper when it is, in the company of others. In the company of others. And not in a private kind of setting where other people aren't around. And not doing so has many negative implications. The first and that is enough, that one would be transgressing the limits of Allah. Secondly, one would be harming oneself, because Allah's limits are there to avoid us falling into harm in this life and the next. This can lead to emotional attachment or physical attachment that can have short-term negative effects or long-term negative effects, right? By still having attachments to that person, and you get married to someone else, it can make one lose restraint, right? Which harms one short and long term. So because of that and other considerations, an important advice also is to get other people involved, right? To get others involved. This has a few aspects. One is in finding a spouse, right? In seeking to find a spouse, you don't have to go it alone, and we've touched upon that. Do get parents involved. If their expectations differ from yours, make your expectations clear, and they may be able to help you find someone. Getting relatives involved, community leaders, scholars, imams, respected members of the community, other couples who are older, and whose circle may have people who are suitable for you. So take those means. But also when you yourself find someone or are considering someone that was suggested to you, get others involved in finding out about the person. Right? In finding out about the person. Again, with that discretion that we've emphasized, but they can help you find out about the person's character, about their interests, about things that are important to you. That does a person care about those things? But you only find out from people who are trustworthy, right? Because discretion is very important in this matter. Don't underestimate your parents. There's something Sister Samana Siddiqui emphasizes in an article as well, because they know you well, right? And they care about you, and they'll often be able to judge or help you judge whether a person is suitable. Right? They may also be able to find you someone, and in that you should make your expectations clear with your parents instead of getting into an antagonistic relationship. No, I want to marry her. I want to find out about him. And so on. They say, no, this is not right, whatever. Work at clarifying your expectations and why you're seeking what you're seeking, but do so in a manner that allays their concerns, right? Because they want worldly success, worldly comfort. They want the good for you in terms that, that they feel are important. So allay those concerns, right? Assure them, reassure them. Right? And those concerns are true very often, right? Even if expressed in the wrong way. Right? They may say something racist that, well, you shouldn't marry. You should, let's say, you're Bengali, They say you can't marry a Pakistani because this, and they say things that are racist, or vice versa. But the underlying concern would be maybe legitimate, not in terms of not Pakistaniness or Bengaliness, but the concern of compatibility between you and the person, between that the person you're considering and your family, you with your in-laws, right? So you always have to come with the assumption that your parents have your best interests at heart, but you clarify your expectations, you allay their concerns, and get them involved. In some cases, they may be able to help you find out about the person. In other cases, they may not, because your mom might not be the most discreet of people, for example, right? But do so with respect. And if you're a parent, Sister Samana's article has some very good advice that you should consider what matters to your children, right? And take them seriously. Give advice while being considerate of where they're at in life and what they have in mind and what they're aspiring to, right? And just as the children should respect you, respect your children's concerns and choices. And even if they're making specifically a wrong choice, right? But appreciate what really it is that they're seeking, right? And be gentle with them, right? Be gentle with them. Don't make this a situation that would break relations or hurt relations with you. But amongst the people you could get involved, right, are, because sometimes, let's say you're a sister and you found a brother who seems to be suitable for marriage, right? It may not be the most discreet thing to just approach the person directly, and this is particularly true with sisters, because we have, Islam recognizes the reality that God has made woman beautiful, right? That's a reality, right? And modesty, especially exhibiting modesty in one's word and conduct, is particularly important for women because of that reality. Although it's just the underlying need to be modest and to act modestly, right, is as true for men as well, right? So, and you should look in the Quran on the narrative regarding the daughters of Shu'aib alayhi salam, and how they approached the potential suitor, right? Walking tamshi ala istihya, right? Walking with modesty, right? Now, you may want to get a friend involved who inquires indirectly, right? Who inquires indirectly about the person. You may want to get someone trusted in the community involved in finding, in asking the questions beforehand. Now, in some situations, you may need to clarify expectations with that person beforehand, but get someone involved on your behalf. And also, when you ask, you would ask those people about, you may ask people who know the person well, and we'll see a few cases of whom one would ask. Here, there's something important that there's a few things that are important with respect to what you ask about. Okay, there's a few things. The first is that you should ask things that are relevant. Yeah, that are relevant. Right? So, and give priority to the things that are most relevant regarding deen and character, but also the person's interests and how they spend their time and whose company they keep, right? This is something important, and that you may want to find out indirectly, right? That's very, very significant, because a person is on the religion of their close friends, right? On the way of their close friends, as the Prophet ﷺ said. So the Prophet ﷺ counseled us that look carefully as to whose company you keep, but when you want to judge, or somewhat not judge, but find out about someone, they may be telling you that they're religious and they spend time with Imam Tahir Anwar all the time and this, that. It may be true that, once in a while they run into Imam Tahir, but who are their close friends? That is a good indicator of where someone is at, though not sufficient on its own. And you don't want to just know from them who they hang out with, because they'll just want to give you a good impression. But that's something you may want to inquire about. A caution is that you don't ask about sin, right? Particularly sin from the past, right? So you can't ask that, oh, did you ever commit zina, or did you ever have a boyfriend, right? Right? Because talking about sin is sinful, and inquiring about sin is also sinful, right? So this requires caution. You can ask about present practice, right? So if someone, if there's, and of course you have to ask yourself that why would you be asking questions about sin if you're trying to consider someone righteous, right? But but you could ask about present practice, that do you smoke, for example, right? Which is, according to most scholars, sinful, right? Or other things like that. But particularly the major sins, you don't ask about past practice regarding them. If you have some reason to doubt, then you could ask someone like, do you drink, right? But you can't ask, have you ever drunk alcohol in your life? You can't ask things like that, right? Because talking of sin is a very serious matter. The Prophet ﷺ said, all my community are well, except those who expose themselves. The Prophet ﷺ was asked by the companions, who are those who expose themselves? And the Prophet ﷺ explained that they're those who expose their sins, right? Who go to sleep having been under the concealment of Allah, and then they rend that cover, right? So that's that's an important aspect about asking. Another, and this is true even if someone's a convert. And people ask, did you ever do this and did you ever do that? You can't. And if someone asks you, you have a right to tell them that this is not, that you just make them aware, tactfully, that these are not things that are permitted to ask about. And you can even deny it. If it's no longer true, you cannot lie that you're still drinking, or you're still committing zina, or you still do these other things, right? So don't ask about those things, right? It's better to find out about the person's religious concern, their company, their practice, etc., in general terms. But you don't say, okay, have you ever watched pornography, right? And these kinds of questions. Now, if you are asked about someone, and this is an important issue that comes up, someone asks you about a person you have to understand that it is permitted for you to mention negative things about another person when someone asks about them, but you can only mention that which is relevant to what they're asking about, such as marriage, right? So if someone asks you about the past of a friend of yours, you cannot tell them, right? You can mention things that have present relevance, or you can mention in a general sense that yes, he wasn't always practicing, but if they've become practicing, you make it clear that but however they're now practicing, and they've made good their practice. But you can't detail the person's past sins. And this is not considered backbiting, because anything mentioned out of sincere concern or insincere counsel is not considered backbiting, right? But only to the extent of the need of the counsel, right? Of the nasiha, right? But only mentioned to the extent of what's relevant, right? Because if you mention too many faults that are not essential to a person's choice, then you may be hurting your friend. So you balance the rights of the person asking and the person being asked about. Now, here, the advice of Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab was very useful. Someone came to him and praised another person. So the Prophet ﷺ, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, asked the man who praised that, are you his nearest neighbor such that you know his goings and comings? The man said no. Sayyidina Umar asked him, have you been his companion on a journey so you can see evidence of his good character? The man said no. Sayyidina Umar asked, have you had dealings with him involving money, which would indicate piety of the man? The person said no. So Sayyidina Umar said, I think you saw him standing in the mosque, reciting the Quran and moving his head up and down. The man said yes. So Sayyidina Umar said to him, go away because you don't know him. Right? That you only know a person ultimately if they're close, right? If you're a neighbor, you're a close friend, and you've kept their company closely, like on a journey, right? You've traveled with the person, you've worked closely with them, or you've had financial dealings with the person, right? But just because, just outward religiosity, right? That you saw him reciting Quran, you saw him organizing events, whatever, that's not indicative of piety. That's not indicative of good character. That's not indicative of being trustworthy, right? These underlying qualities. So, this is the type of person that you get involved and that you ask regarding the person. Now, another important advice is seek references, right? Ask the person who knows them well, right? And then, of course, you should judge whether this person seems trustworthy or not, right? So people who know them well, right? And Sayyidina Umar's guidance there was quite indicative. If you don't know who knows them, you can just ask the person directly. And if you meet the person, observe the adab of meeting, right? Remember the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ said, whenever a man is alone with a woman, in khalwa with a woman, shaitan is the third party. And this hadith is sahih, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, none of you should meet a woman alone unless she's accompanied by a relative, right? Or they say it's not necessarily just a relative, it could be a trustworthy third party, but you can't be in khalwa, you can't be alone with the person. Now, khalwa itself is physical aloneness with the person, right? But interacting, especially on an ongoing basis or for a lengthy time through other means, whether by talking with them, by messaging, through social media, right? All of these are not khalwa itself, but the consideration related to khalwa does apply, right? That if you're not careful, if you lose restraint in that, the shaitan is the third, right? So be careful to limit your interaction, right? Even if you're not in an actual khalwa situation, you're not meeting up privately in a room or in a private place. However, beware in other modes of interaction from two things: ongoing interaction, right, and lengthy interaction. Keep it business, right? Keep it business-like and to the point, to quote the article that we've suggested, right? And it is best, as is clear from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that it is best that there be a third party, right? Whether a relative or other people who are upright, trustworthy people, right? And even if you're trying to find out about someone, through digital means, then do so with a third party involved. It's much better to interact by email, right? And copy someone into it, right? Copy someone into it, right? Let's say, um, Dr. Khalid, both of you know Dr. Khalida because, she was your Islamic studies teacher um, for Sunday school or whatever, or, Imam Bakr, right? So, initiate an email to that third person that, so and so and so and so, Zubaydah and I are considering each other for marriage. We wanted to ask some questions. Would it be okay if we CC you? Why? Because then you would have that restraint that may not be there if you're just going to have ongoing communication. And if you do it through a trustworthy party, they may be able to help you in asking the right questions and so on. But be careful of not just of talking on the phone, right? But also now, you have text messaging and IM and Facebook and all these different ways of communicating. And very often it becomes flirtatious, right? And there's and sometimes that flirtation isn't explicit, right? But there's a basic reality that men are attracted to women and women are attracted to men. And if they interact where one or both parties may be considering something more than just business or some other need, then attraction is a reality and can get expressed in ways. So be careful about that, and limit your interaction. Infuse that interaction with the Islamic values of iffah, of dignified restraint, of haya, of modesty, right? And when you do interact, they say, the basis of interaction between men and women is restraint. And one avoids interacting without need. And when there is need or benefit in interacting, one interacts for the need, to the extent of the need, in a manner that is appropriate, right? And not beyond that. Because there can be many negative consequences, not only falling into the haram in the immediate, right? And that's a reality, but also that this can lead to, and the haram can be direct or indirect, but it can also lead to long-term negative consequences in terms of emotional infidelity, right? In terms of there being residual attachments, and this can affect future relationships negatively, both directly and also through just losing that sense of restraint and being able to be committed to one person, right? And here, a lot of people who are otherwise religious just start becoming lax in their interaction, just hoping to find someone, right? And that's not correct. And there's some solid advice from Imam Nur Abdullah in the article that we've recommended. And we've also shared, the video on gender interaction. And that has some useful guidelines, right? And there's also, the kinds of topics to be discussed, one should be specific about them, right? Because you don't need to know whether she likes eating cookies and cream ice cream or dulce de leche or chocolate chip, right? Because honestly, if you get married, get both, right? Those aren't the significant things. So ask the relevant, pertinent questions with respect to religion and character and broad life interests and goals, right? But do so in a formal manner, right? Like that's why, when you speak, be businesslike and to the point, as the article mentioned. And also, ultimately, you have to, there's an important element of consigning the matter to Allah, that you want to just determine certain things. You have to trust in Allah beyond that it will work out. And, you're going to be consulting others anyway about the soundness of your decision. And so you don't think that you have to ask extensively, right? Some of the topics that should be asked about are, the person's Islamic background, the level of their Islamic learning. You want to get a sense of their religious practice, whether they are a person of spiritual concern, what do they do in their free time, what are their worldly goals, future career and education plans, what are, whether, how many children they want, when they want to have children. For sisters, it's important to find out whether, the person will be fine with them working, if that's something that's important to them. These kinds of matters about where, and certain questions are asked initially and certain questions are asked later, right? And let's say you consider someone and it's not the right person for you. An important thing is that you should handle refusal in the right way. Realize that it's not the person who is refusing, that ultimately this is not something that Allah has destined for you. And contentment with divine destiny is a religious obligation. Contentment with divine destiny and accepting it and seeing it from Allah, and not objecting directly or indirectly to what Allah destines, is an article of faith, right? Is an article of faith. Al-rida bil-qadr, right? Contentment with destiny. Even though, this might have been something you're really looking forward to or hopeful of. And then you also have to have trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Trust in Him, both in that this thing not working out was best for you, and also trust that Allah will facilitate what is best for you. And in that, we would recommend that you read, that you recite and reflect upon verses 2 and 3 of Surah At-Talaq. Surah At-Talaq is Surah 65, and we're sharing the tafsir of that with you. So those are, if you find yourself in that situation, but to be able to mitigate that situation, don't get yourself emotionally involved, right? And of course, emotions aren't something that, there's an aspect of it that you can't control, right? But there is an aspect that you can control, right? Because sometimes the heart becomes attached to someone, but in that, you have to be willing to let go of that attachment for the sake of Allah and in trust of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this is one of the things that, one of the reasons why you have to keep yourself from excessive interaction, right? Excessive interaction, so that you don't develop that kind of attachment. The other aspect of that is that this finding out phase should not be too long, right? Should not be too long, should not be protracted, right? And the amount of direct, one-to-one interaction in that has to be minimized, right? That's very, very important. And also, when you say no to someone, do so in a dignified manner. Do so in a dignified manner. And once something is over, it's over, and don't get back to it. And the believer also does not sort of hesitate back and forth in their decision making, right? So only make a decision when you're reasonably sure, and once you've made it, move on, right? Move on. Don't keep going back to it that, well, maybe this and maybe that, because that opens the workings of the devil, right? So that you know, if you refuse someone, then just move on. Unless something drastically changes, don't keep yourself in that hesitant halfway point. And if you refuse someone, then you refuse them, and then don't go back and say, well, if I had agreed to them, I would have had a good marriage, etc. That is from the workings of the shaitan. The third and final part that we want to touch upon is regarding engagement and interaction. And here there's a few things. The first is, what is engagement? Engagement is a promise or a commitment to marry. That's all it is. It's a promise to marry. And so you should not make a commitment to someone unless you have the resolve to follow through with it. But once you do make the commitment, right, you should follow through with it unless circumstances change, and you do have a right to break an engagement. But you should not make that promise, and it doesn't have to be in a formal engagement, but rather, you don't give your word that, yes, I want to marry you, unless you have thought through and this is what you're reasonably committed to doing. And with that, you have to understand that there's no legal status between two people Islamically of being engaged, right? It's simply a commitment. You can have an engagement party, whatever, just as a social function and so on. It's not a religious matter, but it has to be done in a manner that's not problematic Islamically, right? You can't hold hands or put a ring on her, etc. And discretion is best, right? Because it's simply a promise or a commitment to marry. Discretion is best. It's best not to announce it far and wide unless you've already set the marriage, right? Unless you've already set the marriage. Because some people, they're still discussing things and say, well, let's get engaged, but they've still not set everything in place. So you can make, if in that case, if you engage each other, right, don't make it public. Avoid making it public until things are set. And the general counsel of the scholars is that the engagement period is best brief, right? Because the two parties are still strangers Islamically. Getting engaged does not give you any greater rights to interact with one another. In fact, it is more dangerous to be, interacting actively with someone whom you're engaged with, because you're only engaged with someone who you find pleasing, or at least acceptable, right? You may well have inclination towards them, or attraction, right? Or even love, right? And then the interaction becomes dangerous, right? So if the two parties are set on marriage, it's best to hasten it, right? It's best to hasten it. And we're going to look at marriage and so on in the next lesson, so we won't go further into that. And in the engagement period, because now you've agreed to marry, there's no need to be interacting further unless there's some important things to discuss. Things, what are these? These are things related to getting married, the contract, the agreement, and so on. And the interaction needs to be limited, right? It needs to be limited, and be very careful about direct personal interaction, and be very careful of not flirting. Guard your thoughts, right? Guard your thoughts, right? And beware of falling into the haram, right? Restraint here is a test of the trueness of your religious commitment, and avoid that which must be avoided in any kind of interaction with the opposite sex, right? Because we've seen, and the scholars have always warned about, the dangerous consequences. The mutual interest is there, the mutual inclination is there, there may be mutual attraction, mutual affection, and that can lead to mutual destruction, right? short term or long term. So be very careful, right? And avoid lengthy engagement. And if you are engaged for a long time, for a lengthy period, avoid lengthy contact, avoid emotional contact, avoid ongoing contact. And if you do communicate, it's best to communicate with a third party involved, both in person and through electronic means. So this is some of what we wanted to share about the engagement period. In the next lesson, we'll look at wedding preparations and issues related to the marriage ceremonies and the lead up to those, after which we'll be looking at a critical lesson on the marriage contract and the marriage agreement. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا والحمد لله رب العالمين.